I wonder perhaps if you could talk about the need to belong, I guess, as kind of this evolutionary drive.
So it's one of the classic questions in psychology are what are the basic drives? We know we can think and feel, but it's kind of all based on motivation, on what you want and need. Freud said the two basic motivations are the sex drive and the aggressive drive. Well, that doesn't really explain everything. I mean, sex does appear to be a strong, maybe not a need, because you can live without sex, but it's often a pretty strong want. The aggression is probably not even the way he thought about it. So that sort of left a gap. Now, I noticed late in Freud's thinking, he did start to come around to separation anxiety, that when people are cut off from others, he focused a lot on childhood. When the child separated from the mother or father or whatever, the child starts to be upset about that. And some of his followers, follow-ups really emphasize that. Now, for me, getting into this, I mean, much of my career has been looking at interpersonal basis of things that people had thought about more privately. So, yes, you mentioned self-esteem, and there's a lot of discussion of that because people want to think well of themselves, but actually, they care a lot more about what other people think about them. You can fool yourself, but fooling other people is a bit more difficult. And ultimately, in evolutionary terms, what matters is how other people think of you in terms of whether they will partner with you, whether they'll work with you, whether they will sleep with you. So what you think of yourself is more more fungible, but more flexible. But what other people think about you. So there's this interpersonal emphasis. I'd gone to a bunch of conferences, and then people were presenting this theory that one of the basic drives, one of the basic sources of anxiety was fear of death. That human beings know we're going to die. This point was made by the anthropologist Ernest Becker, and the so-called terror management theorists in social psychology, Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski and Sheldon Solomon, had argued, taken this into the lab, and argued that this is one of the master bases of motivation, and that anxiety is based on knowing that you're going to die someday. So I didn't know much about anxiety, and I talked to colleagues and said, "But this didn't quite seem right. Even it didn't seem to fit with the theory or the evidence I had about it, even intuitively. How often do people think about, oh, I'm going to die someday? That's too bad." Um, but I thought, really, anxiety is probably a lot more about being rejected and abandoned by your lovers or fired from your job or kicked out by your club or family or whatever. So that seemed to me a more plausible source of anxiety, again, emphasizing the interpersonal dimension rather than the intrapsychic, or the fact that you're going to die someday. That's your deal. But connecting with others, that and the fear that that won't happen, and that's very fundamental in our we're a very social species. Anyway, I engaged a colleague, Diane Tice, who's actually now my wife, and she said, let's just read all the literature we can find on anxiety and see what the basis is. And well, there is some anxiety about death and injury and things like that, but most of it is clearly social. Most of it is the fear of being rejected or abandoned or dumped or whatever, and that's the strongest part of it. So we wrote that up and published it, and there was an exchange, and then there were some comments by others, including one by Leary. And when it was all done, he said, "Well, I think you were right about anxiety, but there's more than that, and we got to extend it farther. That this concern with connecting to others and not being abandoned and rejected, that this goes farther than just being the basis of anxiety." So we kind of floundered around, what should we do? Should we organize a symposium or edit a book with chapters by different experts? And we started looking at other research literature and said, oh, we could cover this and cover this. And so it grew into that paper. But as you see, we really stumbled into it. It's now my most cited paper. And as your listeners may know, citations are one way they evaluate scientific works, by how often is it mentioned in other people's writings. They sort of computerized list, look at the reference sections, the bibliography for every scientific article that's published. And this one has been, I don't know, mentioned something like 35,000 other articles. We had no idea that it was going to have that kind of an impact. And as I said, the idea was not radically new that people have this. You can even find it in Freud. He didn't make a big deal of it. And most other people acknowledge that, yeah, people like to be with other people, but it was sort of an afterthought in the background, one of the minor motivations. So our contribution was to take it up front and say, no, this is one of the major driving forces, and it shapes how people think and how people feel emotionally and how they act. And the health data just blew me away. I remember already there was one book saying that mortality, death from every known cause of death, was higher for people who are alone in the world. That just having social connections. I heard some other people talk about the medical establishment was very skeptical that social support would make any difference. And so they started counting how often does people come to visit you when you're in the hospital. And the more often more people come, the faster you recover and get over it. And this was, come on, illness is caused by disease and injury, and that's why you're in the hospital, not because of some social thing. And yet the data were clear. Later on, I think the great John Cacioppo was studying loneliness, would actually give people a small cut on their finger, and he was measuring and comparing lonely and non-lonely people, and they just have them come back to the lab and see how fast it healed. A small cut on your finger, we all get those. And sure enough, the lonely people, it took longer for their finger to heal this small lesion, um, than for the non-lonely people. So it seemed to affect everything, and that's why we started saying it's one of the fundamental drives. As for a want versus a need, we had to argue that. As I said, sex, people want sex a lot, at least some certainly a lot of young men. Um, but it's not a need. You can live your whole life happy and healthy and so on without ever having sex. But belongingness, it's more than a want. It's as I said, people die faster when they're alone in the world, and they're more prone to mental and physical illness and all sorts of other problems. So anyway, that was the idea, and we got that article published, and then that sort of led to 20 years of studies of rejection in the laboratory. You say, okay, well, if this is a basic need, what happens when people block that need, when you're rejected? And we set up laboratory procedures to give people a rejection. We'd have maybe a bunch of young people come in and talk for a few minutes to get to know each other, and then say, all right, for the next part, we're going to have you pair off. So list the two people in the group you'd most like to work with. And so we collected all their preferences and threw them away, and just randomly went around and said to each person, either everybody picked you or nobody picked you, and then looked at consequences of that. So we did that. We had a variety of other procedures too, to study the effects of rejection. I mean, our initial theory was that, well, if this is a big motivation, getting it blocked, getting rejected, is going to cause a big wave of emotional distress, and that could even carry over into behavior. So we set up our studies to do that. We found huge effects on behavior for lab studies, but we could never get any emotional reaction. So that was a big surprise and a puzzle to us. And we tried every different way we could think of to measure emotion, and no, they weren't doing it. That was just a puzzle that stumped me for a while. And then finally, I was at an international conference, and Leary was there. He'd been working with someone else reviewing mostly the animal research literature on what happens to, say, like baby rats who are kicked out of the litter, who are rejected there, and they become insensitive to pain. It's like their body responds sort of with a shock reaction, like sometimes you get with physical injury, that you don't feel pain. So I wondered, well, could that be why we're not getting any emotional reaction? That the body maybe releases some opioids and blocks out the pain of rejection? Because people think back and they remember feeling bad when they were rejected, but maybe it wasn't the immediate reaction, which is what we were getting in the laboratory. Since you felt nothing, you wouldn't remember it. You don't remember feeling nothing. So we bought a pain machine and started trying out these rejection manipulations, and then seeing how well people could tolerate pain. And sure enough, uh, people, modern college students, getting a rejection in the laboratory became insensitive to pain. They could take twice. It was a little, it's not, Frankenstein's monster kind of pain machine. It's just a little thing on your finger that starts pressing harder and harder. And there are 2 points. At one point, you say, "Okay, that hurts now," because at first it doesn't hurt at all. And you say, "Okay, it's starting to hurt," and then they say the second point, you say, "Okay, that's all I can take. Turn it off." Sort of the threshold when you're first feeling it, and then the tolerance, which is how much you can take. And both of those went way up among people who were rejected. They just didn't feel it. And that correlated with the emotion too. So that's kind of what we came around to for a circuitous route. You were asking where I get my ideas from. A lot of them are just following the data and saying, this isn't what I expected. Why could this be? Why do we get these huge changes, say, in aggressive behavior, helping behavior, and others among people who are rejected? And yet they're not reporting any emotion. That was our theory. The emotion was going to drive the actions. But it even led me to question the role of emotion in behavior more generally. But that was another project.
When people felt, as you said, that kind of rejection, that they become perhaps more resistant, I guess, to the feelings of pain. And from that, I kind of go back to lessons in biology that our body wants to stay in homeostasis, and that in some ways, I guess, that aversive states can trigger kind of motivational states. And I wonder, just in terms of, for instance, of rejection, I wonder, is that actually what's going on? That someone has this aversive state, like ostracism, rejection. Does that then, I guess, put them in kind of like a motivational state, which is not what perhaps what people think about, but it makes them kind of want to reach out to others more, perhaps makes them perhaps want to take more risks or become more numb to pain or want to kind of compensate for their needs in another way. Is that what's going on there?
Well, I don't think that's quite it. There is evidence of that too. I'm not sure that's what's behind the pain thing, but when you reject people and give them a chance to connect with others, then well, they have two goals. They don't want to be rejected again, but they do want to improve their connection. So you have to offer them a very safe way of connecting with others. If there's the prospect of another rejection, then they stay out of it. In terms of the pain, I think what happened there, and this is kind of a speculative theory, but this is the best fit to the evidence. Um, well, this goes back to this guy Panksepp. Uh, he said that when animals evolved to become social, they didn't develop all new organs. They just sort of rejiggered or retrofitted the ones they had to deal now with social situations. So you're really reacting to a social event as if it's a physical event. Now, the shock reaction to injury, which immediate injury will numb out your body so you don't feel pain that much. I think many people have had experience like this, maybe when they're playing some very physical sport and they're having a great time and it's very exciting. And then an hour after the thing's over, they say, "Oh, what did I do to my foot or my leg or something like that?" So you banged it or injured it in some way, but you didn't feel it at the time at all. Uh, and nature seems to have arranged that. My guess is it's so that an injured animal can get to safety. If it's in a fight with a bigger animal and trying to preserve its life, and gets its paw hurt, going ow 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 my paw, that's not going to help. So the body numbs itself out so it continues to fight, and maybe if it escapes, and after it escapes, then it starts to hurt. So that it knows to favor that limb and protect it and let it recover. But in the heat of battle, or if it's fallen in the river and is trying to swim to safety, or in the heat of the moment, it needs its system working well so it doesn't respond to pain. So that's essentially the same system that is reacting the same way to social events. And I don't know that it has all that much utility. We found often people they say they want to reconnect, but they're acting in antisocial ways. They were less likely to help others. They were more aggressive toward others. Um, so these are counterintuitive. and maladaptive ways to respond. What we later figured out seems to be going on is that when your emotion system shuts down, you lose empathy for others. So you can't really relate to others. And empathy is a big factor that makes you help others when they're in need, and also restrains you from aggressing against them when you're angry at them. Because, well, how would you feel if someone did this to you? But they don't really think the other person is feeling much because their own system isn't giving them any empathic emotion, so they don't they don't really care. It doesn't move them. So that's not really a useful or adaptive system. I think it's there because of the more physical basis for dealing with physical problems and dangers. But we still have it in the social animal.
One of the things that comes to my mind is that clearly, evolutionarily, social relationships was so important that I imagine that, if
Mhm.
you went back to ancient Greece, I think it was, Socrates that was given the choice between exile or death,
Mhm.
and he chose death. I mean, I'm, clearly there's a huge evolutionary effect that social relationships count. And one of the things that this has kind of got me thinking about is all the ways in which we could experience kind of mini rejections. And, if you look, for instance, at, recent times, of course, the question is going to come up about, for instance, how social media is, of course, affecting these relationships. Likely, probably, I'd imagine, even more so in adolescence, a period of time where we know that social relationships seem to matter so much more to them. There's of course been new books, like for instance Jonathan Haidt has just released a new book um, on this. But I'm just curious, how you kind of conceptualize how digital technologies could be perhaps altering the way in which we, I guess, interact, or our social motivations, and perhaps, I guess, later hypothesis, for instance, like the one set out by Haidt about how they're having this very negative effect, for instance, on upcoming generations.
Yes, Haidt is an important thinker, and I think the view that the involvement in social media and smartphones and stuff is really causing all the problems for today's youth. Um, that needs to be taken seriously. I don't consider it a proven fact yet. It's a strong candidate. But there are people who question the evidence. Obviously, some people are able to use social media quite a bit without any mental health problems. Uh, but we can look at a few other things that might be factors here. Um, One that struck me is back when I was reading the stress research, having a break from stress really reduces the cumulative effect of it. This was shown most dramatically, I think, in the big world wars, where they were just soldiers would be at the front and eventually would have a nervous breakdown, and they called it shell shock and combat fatigue and other things. And they didn't understand how normal, healthy men would suddenly do it, and they gradually realized it was the constant, nonstop exposure that did it. And if they would rotate the men back occasionally away from the front lines, so there'd be a safe period, the body's stress could come down. And this is a strong effect. There are studies with rats showing the same thing, that being constantly exposed to stress is causes a lot more stress and ulcers and early death in rats than even if there's just an occasional break, a safe period. So in that, applying that to the modern situation, I mean, by contrast, when I was in high school, of course, there were all the stresses of figuring out how to relate to others and talk to girls and all that stuff. But it was over when I got home. There's no contact with everybody until I went back to school the next day. There was none. But now they're on 24/7 with the social media. Somebody could be looking at your online profile in the middle of the night. There's communicating, sending texts back and forth to your friends, and, oh, do you know what so and so said about so and so? uh, all that stuff is going on. So the stress is more permanent, and I wonder how big a factor that is. I notice when people, there are a few studies when people take breaks, even limited breaks from social media and communication technology, they seem to do better. They show improvements in their overall well-being. Um, Now, to go to the extreme and say we should ban these things entirely, well, that's not likely going to happen. But at least arranging some serious breaks when you don't have to worry about it, when your body can relax from the ongoing stress. That's there. One of the points Haidt made that I thought was really interesting. He cited some study where he asked kids how much would you have to be paid to give up your your cell phone for a week or something like that, and they asked for various amounts of money, $50 or something like that. And then in another condition, they asked him, how much would you have to be paid if you and all your friends gave up their cell phones for this? And the amounts were much lower. In fact, some people said, I'd pay you for that. And that really struck me. It's not the individual thing; it's being part of the collective where this is so centrally important and ongoing that's what stresses out the young people. And there are many other things going on. I just saw something about the smaller families. We're having an election, and one of the candidates brought this up as an issue. But um, there's more strain on the social relationships because you don't have as many friends, perhaps. You certainly don't have as many brothers and sisters as you used to have, and your social contacts. Just everybody doesn't go out in the street and all the kids play with each other for a couple hours the way it used to happen, but rather it's carefully managed play dates arranged by the parents. So there isn't as much social connection. That means that the threat for each one is a bigger deal that can contribute to it. So likely there are multiple things going on. I remember I spoke with John Haidt a while ago, and he was first getting these data together, and he said the mental health crisis is most acute among young women with strong leftist and feminist political views. And so, well, that's an interesting sort of moderator. I mean, the young women and the young men with more conservative views or whatever, or maybe religious affiliation, they're in the same environment, but why aren't they affected to the same degree? That's a puzzle at this point. It's just a question for speculation, um, but that's an important clue as to who is being affected and who's most vulnerable.
I imagine I'm thinking of it in terms of these, I guess, a kind of like a pseudo fulfillment of needs in terms of, uh, the advances in modern technology that I guess are giving people just enough to perhaps satisfy one of these drives that we've talked about without actually giving it the real thing. So, for instance, just in the same way that perhaps pornography is inhibiting men from actually going out and speaking to young women without ever actually giving them the satisfaction of going through the learning process and attracting a mate. Could it be the case that, for instance, that social media is also kind of giving the sense of a pseudo connection without actually having the kind of the richness of an actual social relationship?
Well, that's an important question, and I'm actually collecting evidence and going to do some writing and some research on that specific uh, issue. I think there is a real connection. We shouldn't be all negative about the technology. I mean, I remember as a young man having a girlfriend in Europe, and I could write her a letter, and maybe in 2 weeks I would get a response. It took a week airmail to get to her, and if she responded the same day she got it, I would get it there. I mean, I loved her, but it was hard to stay close. Whereas, I was just recently in Europe, and I could Zoom with my wife in real time and talk to her almost every day. Uh, so technology does enable us to connect in other ways, and I'm here right. I'm living here up in the mountains. I have that many people around, but I can Zoom with colleagues all around the country and talk about life and work and ideas and relationships. And you used to have to go to a conference to have a beer with somebody and talk about your latest ideas. But now you can do it at home. So there's definitely a plus. On the other hand, something is lost when you're not there in person. I was reflecting on this last fall. I taught a seminar at Harvard, and uh, we worked out it was exactly 50 years since I was a senior at Princeton, and these were mostly upper level seniors and juniors there. So half a century had gone by, and sort of reflecting on the different experiences. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have smartphones. We had to study a lot more because it was before great inflation. And so after dinner, we'd go and study for 3 or 4 hours. But then we would get together, and those are the marijuana smoking days. There was also some people would get together at the pub and have a beer. But you would be physically present with other people, and I think you would laugh out loud and talk, and just have the presence. If you go home to your solitary single dorm room and just text with others and email, I think it doesn't engage you in the same way. We got some very powerful sources of evidence for this. Psychology has been going through this replication crisis. So I looked at social psychology at all the multi-laboratory um, replication attempts that have been done. There's something like 36 that had been published, and three-quarters of them were complete failures. But only a few of them, and mostly the successful ones, had live social interaction. More and more social psychology relies on having people sit alone at a computer and what would you think about this or what would you feel about this? And, that's a valid method to learn about, but apparently a lot of the phenomena that traditional social psychologists study don't really come through as well. We were stunned at how strong the correlation was between any live personal interaction, even just having the experimenter in the room asking you the questions and administering the stuff versus having it all done by computer. Um, and then convergence from another source during the lockdown, during the pandemic, teaching went online, and everybody says the students just couldn't stay focused nearly as well. There seems to be some effect where if you're sitting in a room with 100 people listening to a lecturer, you can pretty well stay focused. I mean, we all know your mind wanders a little bit now and then, but you can sort of keep up. But somehow the professor giving the same lecture into a Zoom link and you listening in your bedroom in your pajamas, it's much harder to stay focused and you don't get the message there. So it's there again, somehow the whole person isn't involved. So anyway, it's a longer answer to your question, I think, than you wanted, but there is a real social connection there. It is something, but it's half the loaf or less than half. It's not the full response. So we're looking for other evidence of that kind of difference. And it's important for society because we're moving toward more and more of these online interactions, and they range from various ones like what we're doing now. We can see each other's image and so on, even though we're thousands of kilometers apart. Um, Others where you're just texting and all you do is get a message now and then and you respond to it in a few words. Email somewhere in between. So we really spend a lot of time interacting with people while we're physically alone, and this is a change in society that is worth exploring.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That's certainly not a novel point with, with serious implications there. So we'll certainly keep our eyes out for what you produce on that. I would love to kind of just switch gears, and one of the things, of course, that you really pioneered, and I'm so glad that I found your work on this because I have to say I certainly had some wrong ideas myself on it. But for instance, going back as long as I can remember from reading Nathaniel Branden's The Six Pillars of Self-Esteem when I was growing up, there's always been this kind of proliferation of people really talking about the importance of, for instance, self-esteem, and there's a continual push for methods to kind of raise it. Um, and of course, I'm become really interested in kind of the relationship between, for instance, self-esteem and achievement. Um, is it the case that self-esteem, is, for instance, is the cause of achievement, or is achievement the cause of of self-esteem? So I just wonder, perhaps, if you could kind of talk through us about some of your work on self-esteem, and yeah, because I found this so fascinating.
That really emerged as a topic in the early 1970s. I don't remember, of course, I was a kid or anything, but from the 60s, I don't remember people talking about self-esteem. There may have been a few. If it was a thing in psychology, it was pretty minor. But somewhere in the 70s, people started noticing that it correlated with plenty of good things, and that people with high self-esteem tended to be more successful in work and school and relationships and better habits and so on. So they said some people took this very seriously as a basis for policy. That California had that task force for 10 years aimed at raising the self-esteem of people in California, saying that this is going to solve our crime problems and even help balance the budget because people with high self-esteem earn higher salaries, and so they pay more taxes, and so it will do all these great things. It was the classic mistake of correlation and causation. Um, Two things go together, but when they started tracking them over time, it really seems that self-esteem at time one doesn't make you do better in school, say at time two, whereas doing better in school at time one does give you a higher self-esteem at time two. Uh, so they go mostly that way. Now there's some more recent work. Of course, when I started saying self-esteem doesn't really do all the things we hoped it would do, and I had really hoped there. I was on the bandwagon early. I did my undergraduate thesis on self-esteem. Um, so I was wishing it were the key to health and happiness and well-being, but but it doesn't seem like it was. Obviously, many people are invested in it, and they've tried to show more effects. But what they seem to have emotional effects, and that I can believe. So, for example, people with high self-esteem at time one, they don't earn any more money at time two, but they're happier about their salary. They're prouder of it. So it's the subjective feelings, and then I can believe that high self-esteem contributes to that. It's sort of a style of looking at your life and saying, "Oh, I'm great, and everything is good, and I'm going to be successful, and people like me, and all that stuff." And low self-esteem is not the opposite. Low self-esteem is more the absence of those positives rather than the presence of negative. Low self-esteem people are mostly saying, "Well, I'm not sure if I'm good or bad, and maybe I'll be successful and maybe I won't." And it's very few people are sure they are awful persons who are doomed to failure and everything. Some will say it occasionally, but most of them don't really mean it. And there may be some with serious mental illness. I don't know about those, but in the normal population, if you look at the objective distribution of self-esteem scores from a scale that measures it, the high ones are really high, but what we call low is really kind of medium. Um, so uh, anyway, I was kind of disappointed, but I wanted self-esteem to be a big key to thing, and it does certainly change the way people approach life. So it has implications. There's a real difference in high and low self-esteem. The high self-esteem people are more likely to take chances, to speak up, to remember walking through Amsterdam one time with a colleague, and they had one of those big outdoor chess boards that's built into the floor, built into the ground. And the chess pieces are as tall as a person, and there were a couple people playing chess and others standing around watching them, mostly men. And my colleague said, "Why would anyone do that?" I said, "Well, it's kind of cool, like, exciting to stand out and play a game of chess against a stranger in a public setting and these great big chess pieces and all that." He says, "Yes, but you could look stupid. You know, what if you lose? You can make a big mistake and everyone will see it." Well, hers was the low self-esteem response. Don't take a chance. My attitude, I guess, more with what the high self-esteem people would do is. Sure. Let's take a chance. I'll probably do well, and I might win. They're sort of more focused on winning and succeeding. The low self-esteem more focusing on avoiding failure and not taking chances. Um, so there are real differences there. But in terms of increasing self-esteem as being a way to improve people's well-being, or especially to make them better at math. I mean, here in America, we're always looking for ways to help students learn more without actually having to do more homework. And so we came up with this idea that, well, if we just tell kids they're good at math, then they'll believe it and they'll internalize it and they will be good at math. But it doesn't really work. You have to do the homework.
At the top end of the scale, if you do look at, for instance, the kind of people that they are very high in self-esteem. I'm just curious how that actually, kind of manifests. Obviously, you mentioned there that perhaps there's an element where they're more likely to perhaps be assertive and take risks. Does it also correlate with, I'm not sure, perhaps things like committing crimes or, spousal success or any other kind of dimensions at the top end of self-esteem?
Self-esteem does correlate with lots of positive outcomes, but again, it may be more a result than a cause of them. Um, what I stopped really working hard on self-esteem some years ago because I realized it wasn't the key. I started looking more at self-control, which is much more powerful and effective for enabling people to succeed in life. But as I recall, there's sort of two kinds of people who score very high in self-esteem. And one kind is just sort of they're convinced that they're great and they're going to go through life and be successful and so on. And the other is a little bit more insecure about it, that they really want you to believe it and they're looking for validation. So, say when they get criticized or something, the first kind, the solid high self esteem, they shrug it off. Yeah, okay, criticism. I can, we'll see if there's anything valid. Maybe I can improve. It's not a big deal. The other kind are very aggressive, and so the most aggression in terms of crime and so on is by these insecure, high self-esteem people. There's plenty of studies of criminals and so on, and this was a surprise to me. I was writing that book on evil in the 90s, and I read a lot of the literature, and I knew there was been heard that low self-esteem contributed to aggression. So I was looking for the evidence of that, but I couldn't find any evidence. And in fact, all the evidence showed that criminals tend to have very high self-esteem, often narcissism. Um, they think they're better than other people, or at least as good. Uh, I remember one book, a woman had interviewed a whole bunch of men who were in prison for rape. And she said they tended to look at themselves as multi-talented superachievers. Come on, they're in prison. But um, other people have actually given self-esteem scales to people in prison, and they compare them. They even think they're more moral than other people who are outside of prison. So there's a big positive distortion among those people, and those are the ones who tend to be insecure. Because if you think you're a lot better than you really are, at some level you may suspect that that's the truth, that's the fact, and so you become very sensitive to anyone else criticizing you or pointing it out. If you're sure you're great, I mean, like if you went to Albert Einstein and said, "I think you're stupid," he's not going to hit you. He's not. He's just going to laugh, you know. Uh, but somebody who fancies himself a major intellectual who isn't. He will be very critical, if and possibly aggressive, if you criticize his intelligence. Uh, so anyway, that's my short answer. There are two kinds of people uh, that fill up the high self-esteem category. Teasing them apart with measurement is difficult, but some people have succeeded in doing it, and the ones are much more aggressive than the others. Um, Again, the insecure ones are highly aggressive, responding to criticism and sort of that sort of thing. We did with my friend Brad Bushman a whole series of studies of laboratory work on aggression and narcissism, which is kind of thinking you're better than other people. That really predicts these reactions very strongly. Self-esteem, the effect was quite weak. There was still higher self-esteem or a little more aggressive, especially if you analyzed carefully, but it wasn't something that popped out the way the narcissists were. And narcissists are not purely aggressive either. Uh, if you if you flatter them and tell them they're great, they're just lovely people. Um, but criticism really sets them off. So and they're specifically aggressive toward the person who has criticized them. It's an interpersonal act. It's not. Freud thought aggression just bubbles up from inside, and you have to do something, whether it's kicking your dog or pounding a hammer or yelling at somebody on the bus or whatever. You just need to let it out in some way or other. But evidence doesn't really back that up. Aggression is a very a response to a particular interpersonal situation.
I love the point that you made about that kind of inner confidence, and that, if you criticized Einstein about his math abilities, that he would probably laugh it off. I imagine if an undergraduate student come up to you and said, you don't know how to publish a research paper, I imagine you probably wouldn't lose too much sleep over it. Um, I would love to kind of ask you about another topic that I think is absolutely fascinating within your work, and I think that this really, I really tip my hat off to you by here, just in terms of the variety also of the topics in which you've written about, and that relates to sex drives between the sexes. And one of the papers of yours which I loved was, we'll put a link to all these below, by the way, for people to actually read them. But of course, you published a series of articles talking about differences between, for instance, the male and the female sex drive. And one of the ones which I'm hugely fond of, and I know this was a really important paper, was where you wrote about differences in plasticity between the male and female sex drives. And I wonder perhaps if you could kind of just give us an overview of this, because this is really, really important work.
Sure, that was a fun one. And then, by the way, plasticity is used in the biological sense of being flexible and adapting, changing in response to circumstances. It has nothing to do with being artificial or fake or anything like that. Um, so, uh, well, what were the roots of it? After I mentioned, I wrote a book on evil, and so I read all these terrible things people do to each other. So I thought, well, for the next project, I want to read something that's nicer. And I remembered the hippie days, make love, not war. I said, oh, why didn't I read the sex literature? I just really went to the library, which is what we did in those days, and just sat down. I got the Journal of Sex Research and started with volume one, issue one. And I basically read from there up to the present. I didn't read all the articles. I read all the abstracts and as much of the articles that interest me, and just looking for stuff. I didn't have very many clear ideas or anything like that. But it started to strike me that a lot of these social influences seem to have stronger impact on women than on men. This was in the 90s, and it was kind of the aftermath of the sexual revolution of the 70s and 80s. And everybody who wrote about it agreed that women had changed much more than men. Um, I mean, the men, and I was lucky enough to be in that generation, we had a lot more chances to do what we wanted after the sexual revolution compared to, say, 1960 before it. Uh, but we didn't really change our desires or feelings stuff, whereas women changed much more fundamentally in their attitudes about sex and in their bodies and all feelings about that. And uh, so, well, that was a big historical change affecting women more than men. And it made me wonder, um, is that generally true, or was that something specific about the sexual revolution? Uh, now, one of the in the mid '90s, one of the great books on sex came out. It was that they collected data, and they had really good data, unlike most sex surveys, which just ask people who are willing to talk about their sex lives, which you get a very biased response because people who aren't into sex don't answer. Um, but they had measured all sorts of sexual behaviors. Have you ever engaged in anal sex and blah blah blah. Uh, and I looked at their tables going through it, and over, the most educated and the least educated women were really quite different, whereas the most educated and the least educated men were about the same. And then it was the same for religion. The most religious women and the least religious women have very different sex lives, whereas for men, they were remarkably similar. So there are two big social forces. And ironically, the authors of the book didn't seem to notice this. They commented on it once or twice, but it was there over and over in chapter after chapter. So for some reason, I was lucky it kind of leapt out at me. The two big social forces, education and religion, and they have opposite effects. More education leads to more sex, more religion leads to less sex, more religiosity leads to less sex, and it's true for masturbation and oral sex and all kinds of behaviors. Um, so that was to me a nice and fairly elegant demonstration that the female sex drive changes more than men. And I embarked on a big literature review to look at that in other ways. So there's studies of immigration, and when you move from one country to another, the men tend to stay about the same. They keep their old country sex morals, whereas the women adjust to the new one much more readily. So over and over, we found this pattern there. It even applied. What I learned in reading the research in the sex field is there were two big camps, two major theories. One was the sort of feminist, social constructionist that they believe there's some biology involved in sex and some role of hormones and stuff, but basically who wants to do what to whom, in what position, how many times, all that stuff, that is a matter of learning and social influence and stuff like that. And that obviously got a big boost from the sexual revolution because behavior across the culture changed very radically in 20 years. And then the other view was the evolutionary view that the desire for sex is based on ancestors and what led to the most successful reproduction, and that it's hardwired, and that the and they believe, of course, there's some impact of social factors and pressures, but a lot can be traced back to that. And the two, they were not just two rival theories; they hated each other. They they despise and criticize, and young people entering the field had a problem doing research because you have to align yourself with one or the other, and then you don't know who's going to review your paper when you try to publish it, and if you say something wrong, the other side's going to have. So what they were starting to do was just publish their data with hardly any theoretical elaboration. Well, what I also noted, though, is that on the one side, the feminists, they tended to be more women. The evolutionists tended to be more men. And so I thought, well, maybe intuitively, maybe they both have a point. It's just intuitively they think the other is so wrong, but it's because men and women are different. Uh, the women know that whether they will do something with someone depends on all kinds of circumstances of what it means and what other people are doing, implications for the relationship and how you view yourself and all that. Um, whereas the men, it's your desire for sex is just there every day, and you feel it. And there's sort of like this beast that shows up when you're 13 years old or something, and you live with it ever. And there were women who switched to be lesbians for political reasons. They thought, oh yeah, well, having sex with men is sleeping with the enemy, and so they would just switch and have sex with women for a while. Whereas for men, the idea, if the biggest male athletes and the president and I don't know who else went on TV advising you to go gay and become a homosexual, that wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. I can't imagine a man changing his sexual orientation for that. So that suggested that again that there's this greater flexibility in the female sex drive. I later learned one of my colleagues here in Utah was studying lesbians, studying female homosexuals. She assembled a big sample in the area, but she said, "Oh, it's such a research problem because she's in my sample, but then she breaks up with her girlfriend, and now she's dating a man. Oh, you're messing up my data." Yeah, obviously she's not really going to say that to the young woman, but she says women just seem to switch back and forth without it being nearly as big a deal, whereas as for men, even the ratio of bisexuals to homosexuals, because most people are just plain heterosexual and that's that. But of all the people who've ever had sex with someone of their same gender, some say, well, I'm purely homosexual, and some say I'm bisexual. The women have a lot more bisexuals as opposed to the pure homosexuals. The men, it seems you're one or the other. And the bisexual, there are bisexuals, of course, but not nearly as many. So anyway, that was the argument with the erotic plasticity, that it's the degree to which the sex drive changes in response to social and cultural and situational factors, and that's just much higher in women than men. And there's no value judgment. I don't really see. I suppose it's a little bit of an advantage to be more flexible because you can adapt to new situations. But as I gave talks about this, every so often a woman would come up to me and said she was proud of her erotic plasticity. I never heard any man say he was proud to be inflexible in sex, but it's a pretty small difference. To me, it's a neutral thing, but it has lots of implications. There's a big study that came out after I'd published that, looking at it was done in the UK. You guys have those great data sets where you track people, large sections of the population over many years, and somebody had gone through those, and you do a big factor analysis to look at which kind of problems go together. And so they looked at where sexual problems, what they correlated with. And for men, sexual problems correlated with physical problems, physical health things. And for women, it correlated with mental health problems. And it again suggests that issues of meaning and understanding and so on are much more prominent. It's why Viagra was able to come out, and for men, the issue is a physical thing. If you can get an erection, problem solved, and you don't need to have 5 years of psychoanalysis and analyzing your dreams and talking about your mother or anything like that. Uh, and and for women, well, it's much harder to do that because um, there it's much more a matter of understanding feelings and meanings and implications there, and a purely physical intervention doesn't seem to do it as much.
If we think, I guess, about the context in perhaps which society has changed in recent times, it's certainly become far more, particularly in the Western world, certainly become far more liberal. I'm curious, your views on, for instance, things that could stifle, for instance, the female sex drive. And I'm just curious, perhaps if you have any thoughts about, is this kind of a patriarchal shutdown of the female sex drive, or could this perhaps be driven by other women in terms of, intersex competition and discussions amongst women? Do you have kind of any thoughts about that?
Oh yes, we published a big paper on that. I worked on this one with Jean Twenge, who was a very staunch feminist, but also a solid researcher. He said, let's look. Most societies control female sexuality more than male, which would be if society has to control sex to some degree. Otherwise, you have babies no one's taken care of and other problems. Since the female sex drive is more flexible, that would be the logical place to control it. Um, Although it turns out there are a lot more laws aimed at at male sexuality than female. Most of the laws about sex are you prosecute men and not women. But in terms of restraining the young woman's sexual activity, found in lots of cultures, I thought this was going to be a big mess. I'd done a lot of literature reviews, and I knew this was going to be complicated with all contrary things. But no, actually, it lined up very simply and clearly. The suppression of female sexuality came almost entirely from the women. It was very little sign of any influence from the men. I mean, you mentioned patriarchy, and I'm not sure patriarchy even exists. Um, I mean, it's something people talk about as a bugaboo, but I mean, I'm 71 years old. I can't recall a single conversation in my entire life when I talk to other men about how can we restrain women or oppress them or hold them down. You know, if there's a patriarchy, they never reached out to me. Um, but but in terms of restraining sexuality, it's something that women do, and that's everything from the bad reputation and ostracizing the young woman who goes farther than whatever the local norm is, to those genital surgery things they do in some cultures where they do some kind of cutting or sewing to restrict the female genitals. That's all entirely run by women, and men are sometimes opposed to it. Um, I even read there was a big study of men, I think in the Sudan, where they were Muslim, and so they had multiple wives, including one woman who had had the surgery and one woman who had not, one wife who had not. And almost without exception, they preferred having sex with the woman with the intact genitals, which stands to reason. It's just much nicer to have intercourse with a woman who's enjoying it than for whom it is painful. So our understanding of it is sort of led to a supply and demand kind of thing, and in many cultures, women didn't really have much economic role. And so, how is a young woman to set herself up for life? Well, sex was the main thing she had to offer for it. I first read this. It was Nancy Cott, a feminist historian, talking about the suppression of female sexuality during the Victorian period, which was exceptionally prudish. Um, and she said, well, the Industrial Revolution had taken away most of women's traditional economic roles, like making clothes. I mean, the textile industry was one of the leaders of the Industrial Revolution, canning food and all those things. And so the woman was kind of economically obsolete in the 1800s. And as Cott said, well, if sex is your only asset, then you need the price to be as high as possible. So, like with any monopoly tactic, you restrict the supply, and that makes the price go higher. And so women put pressure on each other to restrict sexuality so that men will be willing to make a lifetime commitment to support her. Um, when what she's mainly offering is sex. Um, so that appeared to be it. Women were like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that periodically restrict how much oil they put on the world market to maintain the price being high. And it works about as well, which is sometimes, but not consistently. Um, so anyway, that's what we found, and again, my co-author was a staunch feminist. I know some feminists don't like these ideas, but she said, no, this shows women taking charge of their situation and being agentic and using their sexuality to control men, and they need to restrain each other because men, it seems, this is not a very nice way to put it, but my impression is men will do whatever they have to get sex and not a lot more. And so you look at changes in the sex ratio, and there are a lot more women than men. Then there's plenty of premarital and extramarital sex, and the men don't make that many commitments and things like that. When there's a shortage of women, a lot more men, then it's a very prudish kind of environment, and there's not much extramarital sex. And the man knows if he loses his woman, he probably won't get another. So he's willing to make the permanent commitment. Um, I, I, I taught I taught a graduate seminar on sex along with a couple other colleagues, and one of them was older, and he had gotten his PhD around 1960. And he said, "Yeah, back then we all married in college because it was the only way to get sex. But hardly anyone gets married in college anymore. Um, Actually, they do. I'm here in Utah, where the LDS, the Mormon Church, is still very strong, and they are against premarital sex, and so a lot of the students do indeed get married while they're still undergraduates, because well, that's the only way it can happen. So, like I said, the men will do what they need to, and the women respond to that. Um, and controlling each other's sexuality uh, is important for that, so that women can't be stealing each other's men, and the woman can have as much sex as she wants without thinking that, well, if I don't give him sex tonight, he'll go find somebody else.
So if a guy is listening to this now, perhaps a young man, and he, for instance, wants to, I guess, up his sexual marketplace value, one tip could be to go to a population in which the number of women far outweigh the number of men. Are there any other tips that perhaps are shown in the evolutionary psychology literature?
Oh well, yes, there are plenty. I mean, the population difference is there, and let me point out that that's also it's an economic thing where the minority rules. It's not a political thing where the majority rules. So when there are lots of men, the sexual marketplace suits women, and when there are lots of women, then the sexual marketplace suits men. It's again like supply and demand. Whichever is less has a big advantage. Um, so, I mean, appealing to women. This is a concern of young men. Um, everywhere. Uh, the studies show that women respond to resources, for one thing. So, making more money and being ambitious and promising, uh, those those do a lot of good. Of course, being physically attractive and handsome, men don't use makeup and things like that nearly as much as women. Um, but being attractive matters a lot. I'm told all this online dating stuff is after my time. But there are many studies on what appeals there, and there's we should talk about the Pareto principle, that 20% of the men are getting 80% of the sex, and women just go through the swiping or looking at the online profiles and so on. So when you're in your 20s, a lot of the men still are not getting a great deal of sex. In terms of what other things women want for a partner, they want intelligence and kindness and sense of humor. Um, Other things, those are no big surprise. But competition for resources, that's a big factor. Um, I've read some analyses that many men have to wait until their 30s, that the women in their 20s, everybody wants them, and they're just having the time of their lives. But the men in their 20s, not so much. It's partly because of what they call the marriage gradient, that men is usually the older one in the couple and slightly more successful, um, more educated, things like that. So um, the the real top males in their 20s, they will still get plenty of attention from women with online matching deals. But the second tier, not so much. But when they get into their 30s, then they're usually farther along in their career, a little more mature, a little more experienced with dealing with women. So they have a great time. They often don't want to date women in their 30s. And the women in their 20s, sometimes they're shocked when they turn 30 because everybody was interested in them and they're the same person. They thought it would just go on forever. But suddenly, when they're ready to finally settle down and find a mate, the men they want aren't so responsive because they're finally having the sort of party and multiple partners and things that they were waiting for for all this time. Um, there's a different timeline if we think of attraction in very basic evolutionary terms, that it's the woman's sex appeal or physical good looks and the man's resources. Well, the man's resources, as his career progresses, he gets more. So it's always rational for him to wait another year. Whereas for her physical good looks, they do peak in the 20s. And so the longer she waits, the less appeal she has. Well, I guess a lot of the talk shows and stuff talk about men being afraid afraid to commit and things like that. But to me, it's just perfectly logical and rational for the man to wait another year. Well, you'll have another raise, or you'll be better at your job, and your appeal to women is probably going to go up. And from the 20s into the 30s and even into the 40s. After 50, maybe the women in their 20s don't want to date you anymore. But there's a long time when your appeal will continue to rise. Whereas for the woman, when she gets into her 40s, very few women in their 40s are attractive as they were at 25. And so it's perfectly rational for her to want to speed things along, and perfectly rational for him to want to slow things down and take your time and see if better options become available.
I gotta say, I've absolutely loved speaking to you. I've wanted to do this for a long, long time. We're also going to link to your Google Scholar profile, which people could read for the next 4 years, reading all of your scientific work. And I really just kind of want to tip my hat to you, Roy, for taking the time and for coming on the show. But before I let you go, I want to ask you the final question that we sign off all of our podcasts with, and that is, what makes a life worth living?
All right. Well, you should have given me that in advance. I'd like to think a day or two on that, but there are many things. Um, Life is worth living. There's at the physical level, the basic pleasures. I try to have some physical fun every day to have something enjoyable at that level. But for meaningful engagement, you need to connect with others. In positive psychology, they have the PERMA list, which is positive emotions and relationships and meaning achievement. Um, so being involved in society and contributing to the general welfare, taking care of your own family, um, and for me, I'm not sure most people would say the same thing, but the fun of ideas. I just love to come across new ideas and new insights, and so big part of my time is spent reading and thinking and talking to smart people to try to understand things better and to find new things. Many of the pleasures do diminish as you get older, but the excitement of new mastery and new insights still seems to be as fresh and exciting as ever. So all of those things, and having just spent a couple months in Germany, I'd have to say probably a good beer is another factor to put on the list.
Amazing, amazing. Right, is there anything discussed today that you would love to tell our audience about, or is there, any links in which our guys can connect with you? Is there anything you want to pass on?
No, it was a great interview. Thanks for doing it. I hope people like the free will book. If you're interested in that topic, really reframing the problem in a new way. I think it's one of my best books. Um, but I don't know that you can trust an author's assessment of his own work. Um, Nevertheless, some other people have said the same. Uh, it's sort of looking at it as a scientific problem instead of as a religious or philosophical one. And everybody agrees that the way the human mind controls behavior is just so different from anything else in nature. So to me, that's the problem for the scientists to address. Um, and well, that was really fun. I mean, things like the time extension. Most animals live in the present, whereas we see our day to day actions as part of a story connected to past and future. Uh, on and on. I don't want to go into it, but that was a fun one, and I hope people enjoy that one too.